Everybody, and welcome back to Ethics and Archaeology. I'm really glad that you could join us. I'm really excited to talk about this week's topic, which is fakes, forgeries, and repatriation. I decided to amalgamate two topics, which is fakes and forgeries and repatriation, which were going to be separate weeks. Decided to combine them just because I want to be able to cover more interesting topics with you and hopefully spark some good debate. Um, and yeah, so that's what we're going to be covering today. The idea is that these things kind of link quite closely to the antiquities trade, which we spoke about last week, and hopefully we'll be able to springboard off this into next week's topic, which I will reveal at the end of this lecture. A special thank you to everybody who commented their thoughts about last week's topic. It was really interesting to hear your ideas, and you all seem to have different perspectives on this, which is really interesting. So thank you for sharing those. I'd really encourage you also to engage with other people's ideas when they do answer the comments and the questions that I put onto the Google Classroom. I think one of the best ways to learn about this stuff is through talking to each other and having discussions and, recognizing where your perspectives differ from other people's. So I'd really encourage you to kind of engage with other people in future if you are able or you feel like that's something you want to do. Because I've mentioned this before, I think, but some of the most important lessons that I got out of my own degree were through kind of discussing things with other students and learning that way. So that's something for you to consider if you're interested in. So let's get into this week's topics. So, because we're talking about two different things that have some overlap but are still different enough, I'm going to separate this lecture into two parts. So first we're going to talk about fakes and forgeries, and then we're going to talk about repatriation. So we're going to go through some definitions of these things, some histories of how these things developed into the debates that they are now, and also what the opinions are about what to do about these topics. But as always, most importantly, what you think is the most important, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts about this. So, fakes and forgeries. How do we define these things? In all technicalities, these two words can be used interchangeably, and a lot of people do that. Reading any kind of scholarly or discussion-based text, you'll find that a lot of people use fake and forgery as if they're the same thing. The way I was taught is that a forgery is an object that is made in the modern day or, contemporary to us that is designed to pass as an authentic artifact. So it's something that's specifically created from modern materials to pass as something authentic. Whereas a fake is kind of everything else which isn't specifically that. So it could be something like two actual authentic artifacts that are broken and then have been melded together to look like they're whole. That happens a lot. Or later relics that are still artifacts, so something from, the Iron Age, which is meant to pass as a Bronze Age thing, stuff like that. So this topic basically refers to people contemporary to us in the modern day, 20th, 19th century, who are trying to pass the objects that they own as authentic archaeological artifacts. This here is an example of that. This is a photo of the Etruscan terracotta warriors, which were housed in the Met for a number of different years until it was revealed that they were completely fake. And yeah, it was a big controversy when that happened. So they're no longer in the Met, obviously. How did we get to where we are now? Well, firstly, we have to acknowledge that faking artifacts is not a modern thing. This was very prolific even in antiquity, although it's harder for us to tell what is inspired and what is meant to be a fake when it was produced in antiquity. And obviously things that were made in the ancient world in that time still have a lot of value even if they were meant to be faked. So, you see this a lot with Roman copies of Greek statues, even though they're not quote-unquote authentic in that they adhere to that culture at that time, they still have a lot of value because they're still artifacts, if that makes sense. So a lot of people made fakes or made copies of things because they admired it and because they love the style, they love the culture. It's something that you see a lot, and it's very interesting to study. I'd recommend that you look into it. In terms of modern fakes, an upsurge can definitely be noticed with the development of early archaeological excavations, mostly in Egypt and the Near East and around the Mediterranean, but obviously elsewhere as well. This happened because people realized that artifacts have value and that people were willing to, pay a lot of money in order to excavate or in order to own these things. And where there is demand, there is obviously going to be supply, as we talked about last week. So people did what they had to. They made fakes and they made money off it. So that's why a lot of the artifacts that ended up in Western museums that came from early excavations and early kind of explorations into the Near East and Egypt, North Africa, the Mediterranean, etc., have actually turned out to be fake, such as the Etruscan warriors that we just spoke about. So that's something that we should definitely recognize. There has been a lot of professional forgery, especially through the 20th century. So, people who are very skilled at working with, metals, pottery, ceramics, whatever, in order to create things that look authentic, to the point that they, can use, special dyes and paints and, use different chemical reactions in order to make things look as authentic as possible, and they've tricked many people. So there's, that's also a very interesting thing to look into. There's been a lot of people who have either been charged for making forgeries or are suspected to have made forgeries, but hard to prove sometimes. And there's also been, unfortunately, maybe not a significant degree, but a fair amount of complicity with archaeologists being complicit in these fakes because they want the notoriety of finding something, perfectly preserved or authentic or whatever. So it doesn't really happen so much anymore, as far as we know, but certainly through the 19th and 20th centuries, it was a thing that happened a lot. Things being smuggled out and then presented later, things just, magically appearing and not being in, the excavation records. Very interesting. My favourite example of this is probably James Mellart, who worked at Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey. Very interesting to read about. Very interesting site, just in general, but, him specifically is very interesting to read about. The development of more scientific approaches to archaeology, including stuff like residue analysis, has really changed the game in terms of being able to prove definitively what is authentic and what isn't. There are a number of other things that are used. Residue analysis does technically damage the artifact, so a lot of the time stuff like CT scans are used in order to look at, what the different layers of the artifact look like in order to kind of, figure out whether it's authentic or not. This isn't my area of expertise, but I find it very interesting. And so as science has evolved, obviously forgery has also evolved to meet it, but I feel like we're at the point now where our scientific methods are pretty strong, and the scientific approach to excavation as well is, accepted. It's pretty much the only way that you can excavate anything without being sued for something. So I feel like the scientific approach to archaeology has really affected the ability to make fakes and forgeries. But as we spoke about with the antiquities trade, there's still a lot of illicit trading of fakes and forgeries and authentic artifacts. So, this stuff is still pervasive, but less so, I would argue, than earlier in our history. So what do you do when you find an artifact in your collection that is a fake? It's a good question, and it's something that a lot of museums have had to face, including the Met and the British Museum and the Louvre and, so many. What do you do? Here are some, but not all of the options. So the first thing is to just destroy it. If it's modern, I guess some people might believe that it has no value in terms of archaeological understandings. Sorry about the birds. It's a time at the moment. The second thing to do is to keep them in storage and out of your museum kind of displays and exhibitions for people to potentially research if they're interested in that, but still not really put a lot of value on them or educate the public about them. The third thing to do is to display them alongside artifacts, usually with little plaques which state that this is a fake, this has been remade, reinterpreted, whatever, in order to show, I guess, how artifacts differ from fakes, or how easy it is to fake something, or how hard it is to fake something, or even just to tell the story of how artifacts were faked and continue to be faked. Fourth option is to give them their own exhibition. Very interesting way of doing it, very interesting way of kind of owning up to the past that we're all part of. And option 5 is for them to be used in education, so giving them to institutions for students to touch and play with, and investigate and have that really hands-on connection to. We spoke about object-based learning last week, I believe, so this ties in with that as well. I personally have been lucky enough to handle some fake Lauriston bronzes, which were in the first 2 slides of this presentation, I believe, and it's always really valuable to have that kind of personal, tangible connection to an artifact. So, hot button issue. This is the bust of Nefertiti, which is currently held in the Pergamon Museum on Museum Island in Berlin. We're going to be talking about Museum Island next week, so stay tuned. But I have a question for you. Do you think that she is real? There have been a number of debates back and forth about this very topic, based on, first and foremost, the lack of scientific notation about where she was specifically found. I believe that there is an 11-year gap between the writings of the person who allegedly found her and then them actually mentioning where she was found. That's a long time in order to make up a forgery. The other thing that people have said is that, her particular features correlate quite closely to modern Western beauty standards, with the straight nose and the plump lips and like the cheekbones and whatever. Interesting comment. Also, her eye being missing is would have been seen as very disrespectful in ancient Egypt. Often eyes were kind of both taken out because they were made of precious gems. Can't remember exactly what they're called, but the statues that were put in tombs to represent the person's soul had eyes because it would reflect light, refract light, and it would look like the person is looking at you. So there's all those. There is also beliefs that while the outside has been tested, the paint, and it appears to be ancient, the inside limestone core has not been tested. And also the fact that the Pergamon makes a lot of money off people coming to see her specifically. I've been to the Pergamon. She's in this corner room by herself, black walls, case. You're not allowed to take photos of her except for outside the room. There's always hundreds of people just standing there crowded around the doorway, trying to look in and take photos that way. And they sell a lot of merch to do with her because she's obviously very iconic. So there's all those arguments. counter-argument is that she has been tested a number of times, both in terms of like the patine and the paint, CT scans, and a whole bunch of other tests have been done on her, which all prove or all point to proving that she is authentic. The other reason why she looks quite different from other Egyptian art, I guess, if you want to call this art, is that she was the wife of Amenhotep IV, otherwise known as Akhenaten, who was responsible for changing significantly the artistic motifs and traditions that were used in his reign, which is why she looks much more human, whereas a lot of other Egyptian art of the time was much more like stoic and idealized, I guess. Anyway, food for thought. Would love to hear what you think, whether she is real or not. So, moving on to second topic, repatriation. Juicy. So, repatriation can refer to a number of things, but when we're talking about art, it's basically talking about the return of artifacts or art or cultural heritage, more broadly speaking, to the country of origin or otherwise the owners of that art, or the heirs of the owners of that art. It basically pertains to requesting these things from museums, because if we know what we have in museums and people can identify that. But to a lesser degree, people do ask for things to be repatriated from private collections when they know it exists too. It's just a little harder to know what's in a private collection because it's private and not necessarily everything's constantly displayed and able to be engaged with. So, opinions for repatriation, for returning certain artifacts to the country of origin. One of the arguments is that artifacts that are now currently in most of the time Western museums were acquired through colonialism, imperialism, and to perpetuate these things is a form of neo-imperialism and of cultural appropriation, to be having artifacts that don't belong to you in your museums, but making money off them, having them as an attractive thing that brings people to your museum. There's a lot of arguments to be made there. Another argument is that a number of things have been repatriated already, often quite quiet, under the table, things that are less political and just to appease people, really. But yeah, with that, the more political, more famous, more attractive, more unique pieces, we're talking Nefertiti, we're talking the Mona Lisa, we're talking the list goes on and on. The Rosetta Stone, Elgin marbles, literally anything you can think of, most likely. Anything that you can think of just off the top of your head is probably still in a Western museum. These things tend to be denied repatriation, usually on the basis of it's not safe, or it's important to the Western country now because they've held it for X amount of years, that kind of thing. So that's the thing. Some things are repatriated, some things aren't. It seems to be at the kind of beck and call of the Western Museum to make that decision based on whatever parameters they want. Another opinion for repatriation of cultural heritage is that it can be better appreciated in its original context. I noticed that one of you actually brought this up when we were talking about the antiquities trade, so well done. You've predicted where I was going with this. A lot of people argue that an artifact can only be fully appreciated when it's surrounded by other things which also pertain to the context that it's from, and that having it in the context which it belongs to kind of lends more authenticity to the artifact itself, but also to the learning experience for the viewer or the visitor or whatever. I haven't mentioned the repatriation of human remains because that's something we're going to be speaking about next week, but obviously that is a big part of this as well, especially like the colonialism and the imperialism aspect, to house, bodies of people, especially of cultures which continue today, such as, many of the cultures which I have grown up around. And I'm sure many of you can empathise with that as well. We're going to be talking about that next week, but that's just something to flag for today. Opinions against repatriation usually centre around this notion that artefacts, especially very ancient artefacts, are part of world heritage and that we all have a stake in world heritage, and therefore they shouldn't be owned by one country, that they should be dispersed and they should be owned by everybody in the world because it all belongs to us. It's human heritage more than it is national or cultural heritage. Interesting. Furthermore, a lot of the Western museums, like the BM, the Louvre, Pergamon, whatever, all of them, and many more, tend to be in quite large cosmopolitan cities: London, Paris, Berlin, the three that I've just mentioned, New York, the Getty in the States, so many. These tend to be in large cities, which means that there's more access, and these cities tend to be ones that people travel through a lot, cosmopolitan, and therefore more people can engage with the heritage, whereas some people argue if the Rosetta Stone was in Cairo, it's like, who's going to see it? I guess people that go to Cairo, but that's an argument to be made. Another similar thought to that is that the more people that can access it are the more people that can research it, and therefore we expand our scholarly understandings of these things. Can that be done if these artifacts are repatriated to their original contexts? That's not up to me to say. I would love to hear what you think. There's another comment or perspective to be made that modern nation states as they stand don't actually have the connection to the culture that they claim to have. Some people believe. For example, does Egypt have more of a connection to the ancient Egyptian culture than anybody else, or any surrounding nation states as well? Does modern Egypt have more connection to that than, say, Sudan, who also had, a lot to do with it? Ooh, not for me to say. And also, some people argue that once you start repatriating things, especially high-profile things, you're essentially opening the floodgates and saying that everything needs to go back, nothing can be shared, and you're going to leave museums empty. She's back! Unbelievable! How did that happen? Another hot button issue for you. Should Nefertiti be repatriated to Egypt? This is something that Dr. Zahi Hawass, spoke about a lot, is that she's like a figure of Egypt, but some people argue that she was excavated legitimately and legally in the time that she was excavated, and that she's technically the intellectual and physical property of the people who excavated her, which I believe were German, hence why she's in Berlin. Has she also become more of a symbol of the ancient world at large, rather than just Egypt and just the current nation state of Egypt? Would love to hear what you think as well. And how do we end up here? Amazing, yes. As always, your perspectives are much appreciated. Next week, we're going to be talking about colonialism. Wow, very easy thing to cover in one lecture. We're going to be talking about that next week, using a lot of the things that we've spoken about today, especially in terms of repatriation. And I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.